Hello, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Moore's October Rants. Today's episode is going to be titled, We Love Our Own Pain. We all seem to have a tendency to hurt ourselves, even when we don't fully understand why. We engage in behaviors that cause pain or distress, despite knowing that these actions are harmful. It's strange, really, because many of these things are choices, decisions we make consciously or subconsciously, even though we know we don't have to do them. We might not always recognize how deeply these actions hurt us, but they often have long lasting negative effects. While it might not always be immediate, the damage is still real. Sometimes it's easy to overlook the harm, but it's there, simmering beneath the surface, affecting our mental and emotional well being in subtle ways. We tend to hurt ourselves in ways that seem almost natural. It could be as simple as the fast food we choose to eat, knowing that it's bad for our health but indulging anyway. It could be more severe, like self inflicted wounds stemming from dark thoughts or emotions, perhaps tied to feelings of depression or suicidal tendencies. Then there are toxic relationships where we allow others to mistreat us, sometimes even physically. Or we engage in reckless behaviors, such as promiscuity, which exposes us to diseases and emotional scars. The list of ways we hurt ourselves is vast, but what connects all of them is the fact that we actively choose these behaviors, even when they are clearly damaging. This self destructive nature isn't new. It's been ingrained in humanity for as long as we've existed. From the earliest days of civilization, humans have found ways to inflict harm on themselves, whether it's through violence, addiction, or poor decisions. The reality is that as a species, we seem drawn to these negative patterns of behavior. The urge to harm ourselves is embedded in our DNA like a shadow we can't escape, always lurking in the background. In fact, I'm reminded of a line from the movie Terminator 2 Judgment Day, where the T 800, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, says, "It's in our nature to destroy ourselves." It's a line that resonates deeply because it reflects an uncomfortable truth about humanity. As much as we might strive to be better, to escape these destructive cycles, they are a fundamental part of who we are. This tendency to self destruct is almost inescapable. It's like we are constantly battling against an innate force that pushes us toward harm, whether we want to admit it or not. Yet, while we can never entirely rid ourselves of this destructive nature, we do have the power to make improvements in our own lives. We can choose to break free from certain harmful behaviors. We can work on making better choices, on being more mindful of our actions. But that's not always easy, and it's even harder when it comes to others. You can't force someone else to change, no matter how much you care about them. You might want to help them stop self harming or making bad decisions, but ultimately, the only person you can control is yourself. Sometimes, watching someone you care about hurt themselves is incredibly painful. It can feel like you're powerless to stop them, even though you want nothing more than to see them take better care of themselves. You can offer advice, support, and encouragement, but in the end, it's up to them to make the decision to change. And sometimes, despite your best efforts, they continue on their self destructive path, leaving you feeling helpless and frustrated. It's easy to fall into the trap of judgment. We look at others who are struggling and make snap judgments about their behavior. We criticize their choices without fully understanding what's going on beneath the surface. Yet many of us are guilty of the same self destructive tendencies. It's a kind of hypocrisy that's hard to ignore. We judge others for their harmful behaviors, but fail to recognize that we engage in similar behaviors ourselves. It's a vicious cycle, one that's perpetuated by our inability to look inward and face our own flaws. When it comes to self harm, the severity can vary greatly from person to person. Some people might engage in relatively mild forms of self harm, like pinching themselves or slapping their arms. These actions might seem harmless on the surface, but they still have consequences. On the other hand, there are those who engage in far more extreme forms of self harm, he cried, like cutting themselves or inflicting more violent injuries. The impact of these actions can be devastating, both physically and emotionally. Every person's experience is different, and the severity of their self harm often reflects deeper emotional wounds. What's important to remember is that regardless of the form it takes, self harm is still a form of suffering. It's not something anyone does lightly. Even the mildest form of self harm is a reflection of deeper pain or emotional turmoil. And we should be careful not to judge others too harshly for their struggles, because we all have our own ways of coping with pain. It's easy to point fingers, but we need to ask ourselves, are we really in a position to judge others when we're dealing with our own battles? Self harm can be deeply ingrained in our lives, whether we acknowledge it or not. It's not always visible to the outside world, and it doesn't always manifest in physical scars. Sometimes it shows up as emotional scars, mental distress, or a constant cycle of poor decisions. But just because it's not obvious doesn't mean it's not there. We all have our own ways of coping with the pain we feel, and many of those ways involve self destructive behavior. It's fascinating, in a tragic way, how self destruction seems to be such a part of the human condition. Why do we choose to hurt ourselves? Why do we willingly put ourselves in situations that bring us pain or harm? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, but it's one that we have to grapple with if we want to understand ourselves better. Humanity is both beautiful and ugly, capable of incredible acts of kindness and compassion, but also of cruelty and destruction. It's this duality that makes us so complex and so difficult to understand. The struggle to cope with our own self destructive tendencies is something that many of us face on a daily basis. It's about finding healthier ways to cope with pain, to deal with emotions, and to break free from the cycle of harm. It's about seeking out healthier outlets, whether it's through therapy, exercise, creative expression, or simply talking to someone you trust. These healthier coping mechanisms can help us navigate the darker parts of ourselves, giving us a way out of the destructive behaviors that threaten to consume us. Ultimately, this is the key: recognizing the harmful patterns in our lives and making the choice to change. It's not about perfection or completely eradicating every self destructive tendency. It's about progress, about doing the best we can to make healthier choices and to be kinder to ourselves. It's about understanding that we all have our flaws, but those flaws don't define us. We can learn from them and use them as stepping stones toward growth and healing. Anyways, thank you for listening to this episode of the Moore's October Rants. Signing out. Have a good one, guys. Goodbye for now.